Welcome, everyone, to the final session of High Strangeness and Parapsychology, exploring the deep weird, the symposium. This is so interesting to me because it's one of my passions, and this particular talk is absolutely one of my passions. My name is Morgan Knutson. I am the co-founder of Entity Seeker Research and Teachings, and in Edmonton, Canada. Hey, Canada. We have with us today Anthony Peake, who will present By Our Bootstraps, an egregorial model of reality. And it's arguing that it is consciousness that creates our reality and matter, and presenting evidence from this from quantum mechanics, cosmology, and simulation theory. I am super passionate about this because this is one of my main fields of interest as well. And I know this is going to tie in a lot for everyone. I'll tell you guys a little bit about Anthony for those who are not familiar with him. Anthony studied at the postgraduate level at the London School of Economics and the University of Westminster. He has written 9 books, co-authored a 10th with Professor Ervin Laszlo, and co-created an 11th, which was nominated for Psychiatric Book of the Year in the British Medical Association Book Awards for 2012. His books have been translated into every major European language possible and have sold over 100,000 copies.
Hello everybody, my name is Anthony Peake and I'm one of the contributors to this fantastically interesting, deeply weird symposium. My approach is going to be somewhat different to my other 2 presenters, I would suspect. And what I'm trying to do is to put these experiences, extraordinary encounters, in a scientific structure. In other words, using the arguments made many, many years ago by a guy called Marcello Trui, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And my approach has always been to try and understand the science and take the science to the skeptics and say, look, these things do occur and we can fit them within your science as well. So what is my approach? Well, the presentation I'm going to be giving today is headlined By Our Bootstraps, an Egregorial Model of Reality. Now, what do I mean by our bootstraps? Well, way back in October 1941, in Astounding Science Fiction Stories, there was a story published written by somebody called Anson MacDonald, and the story was called By His Bootstraps. Now, we now know that the author of that was actually Robert Heinlein, the very, very famous science fiction writer. And what he meant by bootstraps was the old idea that can you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps? Now, of course, we know you can't because there's a circularity going on. You're using your own energy to lift yourself off the ground, which of course is impossible to do. But bootstraps theory is more than that for me. It suggests that there is a reciprocity between us as the observers of the universe and the universe itself. In other words, it's a symbiotic relationship, and we're co-creating the universe around us, and as the universe creates us as well. And what I'd like to do is to explain what I mean by this, and I'm going to build up from a series of analogies and science to build up to the overall picture. So without further ado, let's move on. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is egregores themselves. What do I mean by the term egregore? Well, one of the most interesting books, in fact, probably the definitive book written on egregores, was written a few years ago by a American gentleman called Mark Stavish. And he very much takes the concept of egregores in its literal sense. The word egregore originally comes from the Greek, which means the Greek for watcher, which is egregorius. And the idea is that we have been watched over for millennia by entities that are non-human. But there is a counter-argument to say that egregores themselves are created by us. And in this wonderful book, Mark Stavish gives numerous examples of what we mean by egregores. For instance, the concept of Coca-Cola, the branding. That is an egregore. It's created by human beings, but it has become independent of us. Also, certain concepts such as fascism and communism. These are also things that people create from the power of thought, but they manifest out there in a far more tangible way than just pure thought. And Stavish's argument is that we can create these egregores and bring them into existence. Now, what this really means is that if you get a group of people together and they work and they concentrate on the same subject, something greater occurs, something greater than the group. Now, I find this myself when I regularly have meetings with my readers, and I've been doing this now for nearly 20 years. And we all agree that when we get together and when there's a certain atmosphere within the group and ideas start to flow out, it seems that we are creating something greater than ourselves. And the ideas seem to flow. And it's been noticed even by sociologists. There was a very famous book written a few years ago about the social psychology of crowds and the way in which when people get together in large groups, there seems to be a different atmosphere and people react differently to both to the group and to other groups as well. So it does seem that we have this ability to meld the reality around us. Now, of course, one of the things that I was discussing recently on one of my podcasts was how curious it is that when two people have been arguing and you go into their house, you sense and know that there's been an argument taking place. You know there's something different about the atmosphere. Even though they may pretend that there has not been an argument, we sense this. It's like a form of energy that's given off that sensitive people can pick up. Now, Wilhelm Reich, many years ago, the German physicist, I suppose for want of a better term, used the term orgone energy and said that there is an energy form that is created in some way. Also, we know from Rupert Sheldrake there's this concept of morphic resonance and the sense of being stirred at. These are all elements of what I would call the egregorial. Now, there has been evidence from the past that egregores as entities can be created. And in my last book, the Infinite Mind Field, I cited some of the writings of Alexandra David Neal. And Alexandra David Neal was a Belgian lady who, in the 1920s and 1930s, took on herself fantastic journeys and travels. And she took herself off to Tibet. And while she was in Tibet, she discovered there were certain techniques that were used by the Tibetan Buddhists. Well, particularly the version of Buddhism that's found in Tibet, which is based on something older called the Bon tradition. And she found that there was a concept they had called tulpas. And a tulpa is an entity or a thought form that can be created by people thinking about it and bringing it into existence. And her associates did exactly that. They concentrated very, very hard and they brought into existence a very round, rotund, laughing little monk. And it manifests, they could see it in front of them, and they independently verified that they were seeing this entity. Now, initially the entity was very dependent upon them. It only needed them to be around to come into existence, and also it clearly was just a thought form. But given time, it started to become more malevolent and more nasty and more independent of the group that had created it. And in the end, they had to collectively dissipate the thought form because it became so independent of them. It seemed to be had independent action. Now, of course, here I'm reminded in many ways of the big thing that people's talking about at the moment about artificial intelligence and the way in which can artificial intelligence ever become sentient. And I would argue that artificial intelligence is an egregore in exactly the same way that we have created, that has the potentiality to be independent of us. So we know from Alexandra David Neal that there was interesting things taking place there, and she was convinced, as have the people of the Bon tradition for centuries, believe that we can create thought forms. And then in 1972, there was a fascinating experiment that took place in Toronto, and it was a British academic who was living over there together with his wife and a group of other individuals who were fascinated by Ouija boards, and they were fascinated by the implications of Ouija boards and how Ouija boards seem to it seemed to be a group manifestation in terms of the messages. So they decided that they would go out and create a ghost or an entity and see if it communicated via the Ouija board. And one of them went away and she wrote up a totally fictional story about a character called Philip Aylesford, who lived in the 1660s, 1670s in Warwickshire in England, and that he had quite a tragic life. He was a Catholic nobleman in a time when being a Catholic nobleman was not a terribly good idea, and they were being persecuted all the time. And also he was in a loveless marriage. And in the story, the person who created the story made out that Aylesford had fallen in love with a gypsy girl. It all went wrong and he committed suicide, tried jumping from the battlements of the castle. The castle, by the way, did exist as well. Now, the interesting thing is that Aylesford started to manifest, initially via Ouija, but then in telekinetic forms. For instance, they would give raps, and they would get rappings in the table, and one knock for one for no, two for yes, these kind of things, or the other way around. And clearly they were astonished by this because they weren't necessarily believers, but they were manifesting something profound. Now, again, if you go on to the web, you'll also find that they did a program in a Canadian television program where the table levitated, and Philip was the individual doing the levitations. Now, again, the question has to be asked is, Philip was drawn in from somewhere else, but developed his own personality and his own strengths, even though he was a totally fictional character. This shows the power of the human mind. But we can take this forward to in 1993 to 1998. There was a series of experiments that took place of a similar nature to the Toronto experiment that took place in a tiny village called Skull in Norfolk, again in the UK. And again, a group of individuals got together and they were trying to communicate with other entities, with ghosts, with the dead or whatever. And they ended up communicating with what seemed to be a group of individuals who were trying to communicate back to them. But again, there were a series of manifestations that took place at the Skull experiment that were beyond the comprehension of the members of the group. There were lights flying around the room. Again, there was telekinetic effects. There was so much phenomenon. And again, I've interviewed a number of the individuals that witnessed a lot of these events, and they swear to me that the things they saw were absolutely extraordinary. Now, was it again because the group so much wanted to be in communication with entities that they made it happen in one way or another? Now, I have my own example of this. One of my friends, the late great Braham Murray, who was a very famous British theatrical producer, who sadly died about 4 years ago. He and I became very close friends towards the end of his life. And Braham was very interested in the kind of work I was interested in, which attracted him to my work, and that's why we became friends. And the reason he was interested in my work was because I'm interested in this concept of the egregore. Because Braham, in his autobiography, The Worst It Can Be is a Disaster, it describes a very peculiar experience he had way back in 1969, I think it was, when he was looking after a comparatively famous Swedish magician, for want of a better term, who was also a Swedish aristocrat called Armand Hernigstadt. And Braham Murray and Hernigstadt were talking one evening about the concept of the egregore. And Hernigstadt, being a magician and knowing about these things, said, yeah, egregore. And he used like the egregore of Nazism and the egregore of fear and the egregore of horror. And Braham told me, he said, Hernigstadt said to him, well, look over at that chair. And he looked over at the chair and he tells me, and he mentions this in the book, that he saw manifesting in the chair an entity, a creature that came into his vision view and looked at him and glared at him and then evaporated. Now, Hernigstadt had created that to prove that egregores could be created. But what Hernigstadt had done, he's actually imposed a scenario and an hallucination into the mind of another human being using presumably telepathic powers. But as Braham said to me in one of the interviews I did with him, that there were two hallucinations taking place here. There was an hallucination of him seeing the entity in the chair, but there was also a hallucination of exclusion, because you couldn't see the back of the chair, which means effectively a part of his visual field had been occluded to accommodate the entity. Now, again, Braham said this entity had individuality. It was real. It was something that had its own motivations. We also know that other writers have said this over the years. A guy called Robert Masters, who was a magician and writer in America, wrote a book called Swimming Where Madmen Drown. And what they did in that book were they were creating ghosts and entities, and they were creating poltergeist activity, all these things, which seems to me again that they are mind created in some way, but they are also independent of us. They work with our anticipations in one way or another. And of course, one of the most interesting writers on this theme at the moment is another friend of mine, Paul Eno. And Paul Eno is an ex-Catholic priest who is now a researcher into psychic phenomena in New England. And he wrote a fascinating book called Dancing Past the Graveyard, and also another book called Turning Home. And the reason he was interested in these things was that he believes that these entities, and he's seen these entities, and he thinks there's a direct link between them and probably plasma. And it seems to be that they use plasma, which of course is the fifth form of matter, to manifest themselves, using our anticipations of them to come into this world from somewhere else. And he also argues that they need us because they feed off us. They feed off our fear. This is why these entities are drawn to us, because by us being fearful of them, it gives them strength and power. Now, of course, this could be intriguing. This could explain an awful lot of why these entities seem to deliberately be horrific. But I've heard tales that when you challenge them and they're trying to be monstrous, they back down, as if it's all a facade that they're using to generate something inside you, which is fear. Now, if this again is the case, how can the human mind create something that it has independent of existence of the human mind? And this has come down to what exactly is the human mind and what is our relationship with external reality, and indeed what is external reality. So let's welcome and let's start now with the science. Okay, we all know light. Light is a wave. We know light is a wave, and we know light is a wave because it diffracts round things. We know that light can bend round things just like a wave would, and it moves like a wave. And if you take photographs, you get light diffraction. And, when you look in the sky of an evening, if there's clouds, you will actually get the beams of light which show that light is diffracted. But, and here is the massive but, is that it also seems to be a particle. Now let's think about this for a second. Light seems to have particle aspects and light aspects. Now, indeed, it was many, many years ago, it was good old Isaac Newton that first thought that light was particulate. He thought it had a kind of a solidity to it. And then he started looking into it, and he discovered that light had definitely a wave format. But the interesting thing is that there's something called the twin slit experiment. And I'll go into this in a second now because it's very, very peculiar. And the idea is, if you take light and you break it down into its individual photons, the individual bits of light that travel, technically called bosons, and you fire them one by one in a line with a particle emitter at a slit in a screen. What will happen is, as you'd quite rightly expect, as each particle goes through the single slit, it will land the other side of the screen on a detector screen. It's rather similar. In one of my books, I use the analogy of kicking footballs through a hole. And if you kick enough footballs through the hole, there will be a pile of footballs the other side. Now, that's if you have one slit in it. However, the strange thing is that if you send particles through, single particles, one after the other, through two slits, you'd expect to find that there would be two piles of patterns where they go through, where the light would be brighter and the light would be darker. Or effectively, using my football analogy, that you'd get two piles of footballs. But you don't. Even when you send them through one by one, you end up with what's called an interference pattern. An interference pattern is effectively as if light has gone through. Because, of course, you put light through two screens. What will happen is that the light will then turn into two more wave patterns. And the wave patterns will cause what's called an interference pattern, which is what is detected on the screen. But the particles are going through one by one, and they're particles, not waves. So how can a single particle not only interfere with itself, to coin a phrase, but also know where to exactly locate itself on the back screen to cause an interference pattern? So what the scientists decided to do was to put a measuring device on one or other of the slits as the single particles went through, to see whether which hole the particle went through, which slit. Now, what is extraordinary about this experiment is every time they do this, the pattern the other side changes. When the particles are being measured, they turn into particles. They're a wave as they travel, but when they arrive, they leave as a particle, and they leave as a particle, turn into a wave, go through the twin slits, and then arrive back as particles. It's as if the actual wave function itself, or the particles, know they are being observed. Or more interestingly, the behavior is being directly influenced and created by the act of observation by a human being or a sentient consciousness. Now, this is extraordinary because this suggests something very, very peculiar about reality. The reason being that science discovered, that not only does light, electromagnetic energy, is made of particles and waves, but also physical matter. Specifically, initially, they discovered this with electrons. Now, electrons are not like photons. Photons are point particles. They have zero mass and they can only ever travel at the speed of light. So they're very, very peculiar things. But electrons, however peculiar electrons may be, they're not as peculiar as light. They are larger than light photons, and they are little tiny bits of matter. Now, this is important. And they discovered that doing the twin slit experiment, the same thing happened with electrons. But they decided electrons are incredibly small, so maybe there's no relationship between the act of observation and the electrons. Now, the reason this is intriguing is that Max Born in the 1930s, a Austrian physicist, concluded that everything has a waveform, that everything effectively is a wave until it is observed and it becomes a point particle. Now, this means, and not only this, but the waves themselves are not waves as we understand waves to be in water. These are waves of rather similar to a crime wave. They're a statistical wave, they're a mathematical function. So they're not a physical anything. So effectively a non-physical wave, so it's not physical and it's not real, comes into existence and becomes a particle when it is measured or observed. Now this is extraordinary. This says that the act of observation or the act of measurement creates the physical world around us. Sounds strange? However this may be, research has been done and they've sent through this wave particle mystery has now been found with buckyballs. Now buckyballs are large atoms. These are molecules. These are not atoms. These are not electrons. They are molecules, large molecules. We're talking, they have 60 atoms inside a buckyball, and they do this. And then they discovered that fullerene which is another substance, which is a curiously safe substance. It's even bigger than buckyballs. This was discovered to have wave-particle duality. And then they found something even more called TPP, which is huge. But, and I recently did some research on this, I won't even begin to try and pronounce what these are called, but there are very, very large molecules now that were discovered, and this wave particle duality I think was discovered around about, I think I've got the paper there, 2019. It was reported in 2019. Now these are absolutely huge. They have hundreds and hundreds of atoms in them, and yet they have wave particle duality. And not only that, but they've been discovered to be the same particle to be located in two different locations at the same time. This is not general news because people just can't accept it. But this is known science, and it's important that we realise that this is known science, because it means that the implications are that, rather like Bishop Berkeley said, the reality out there, if you're not looking at it, doesn't exist. It needs consciousness, or it needs some form of sentience, not only to make sense of it, but to bring it into existence. Now, I've always loved this cartoon because it gives the idea of, that there's this guy talking away and there's this superposition of all states behind him. And he turns around and he looks at the person and they become a physical person, and they turn away again and they go back into a supposition state. This is a cartoon that was in a science magazine. Okay? So this is how accepted this is. But it gets weirder. Profoundly weirder. In my new book, I'll be discussing this in greater detail. But there was one of the most famous quantum physicists, or cosmologists as well, over the last 50 years of the 20th century, was a guy called John Archibald Wheeler. And John Archibald Wheeler was the PhD tutor to an awful lot of very, very famous scientists, from Richard Feynman to Hugh Everett III. Lots of people all passed through his tutelage when they were doing their PhDs. And Wheeler came up with, he calls the participatory universe. And he argues that there is a participation taking place between the observer and the observed. And we bring physical reality into existence. But not only that, because of course the billion-dollar question you guys will be asking, well, if this is the case, how can that be explained about things in the distant past? Well, Wheeler argued that they can use a thing called the delayed choice experiment to prove that galaxies and quasars that existed billions and billions of years ago are brought into existence by the act of observation now. And again, if anybody wants to look this up, it's called the Cosmic Twin Slit Experiment, and by all means check it out because it's well worth reading. I haven't got time to explain it here in greater detail, but it effectively shows that we bring the past into existence as well, and by implication possibly even the future. But it seems subatomic particles themselves, there's a direct relationship between them and us. In my new book, I have a section on what I'm calling now egregorions, which are subatomic particles that seem to be brought into existence when we anticipate them. Time after time, I have discovered, time after time, quantum physicists think about a subatomic particle, and lo and behold, they find it. It's as if the particle is waiting to come into existence when we think about it. Now, for instance, in 1934, at the discovery of the muon, which was a subatomic particle they were searching for, II. Rabi, who was a quantum physicist and a Nobel Prize winner, made the statement, "Who ordered that?" Making the statement as if, we obviously anticipated this and it came into existence. So what does this mean? How can we possibly bring reality into existence? What processes can there be whereby the power of thought can bring about physical reality? Well, there's things we need to understand about reality. And I will just drop this in now and leave it with you. You're all sitting on chairs, I guess. You might be standing, or you're standing on a floor or anything else. What you're doing when you're watching this presentation, you are in contact with either a floor or a tabletop or the seat of a chair. That physical seat of the chair you are sitting on is 99.9999999999996 empty space. And the particles that are in there are point particles and extremely tiny. So why do you not fall through the chair? This is what people will turn around and say, well, if physical reality is not real, why don't we fall through the walls, fall through the chairs? Well, we would, except for something called electrostatic repulsion. At the edge of every atom, and therefore every molecule, is the outside ring, or the outside shell, which contains an electron. Electrons are negatively charged, as are the electrons in your bottom and the atoms that make up your buttocks. As we know from our schoolhood science, that like charges repulse. And that's why you don't fall through. Purely and simply, you never ever touch anything. So when you believe that you touch the world, you interface with the world, you don't, ever. You have never, from the moment of your birth until the moment of your death, ever touched anything. Bear that in mind. But Carl Lashley, who was a neurologist, was very interested in actually trying to find out where memories were in the brain. And he spent a whole career analysing the brain of rats and everything else to find where memories were. And he couldn't find the location of memories. There was areas where they could process memories, but that's different. It's rather like a radio processes a radio signal, but it's not where the studio is. And what he decided in the end of his career was that memories were all over the brain, and they worked non-locally. They were in instantaneous communication with each other in some way. And memory is stored in various areas of the brain, and we instantaneously put these memories together. Another one of his students was very interested in this, was a guy called Karl Pribram. And Karl Pribram came to the conclusion that consciousness itself is non-local. Consciousness itself is manifested in the brain, but it's not actually part of the brain. Consciousness is prime, and we attune into a field of consciousness. And this is where we really reside. These are meat machines that allows us to exist within whatever this reality is. Now, Pribram was interesting because Pribram argued that the brain works holographically. But also, there was another researcher, which I'll touch on a little bit later on, called David Bohm, who was a British-American, he was at Goldsmiths College, I think, and quantum physicist, who had to leave America in the 1950s because he fell foul of the witch hunts, the McCarthy witch hunts, because he had been a communist. But he also argued that reality is holographic in nature. So Pribram is saying the brain is holographic, and Bohm is saying that the universe is holographic. So therefore we have a hologram processing a hologram. So here we have another bootstrap, don't we? We have something else raising itself up by its bootstraps here. And I think bootstrap theory is really because there's an underlying reality and an underlying science that we haven't got to yet. Because our science is so stuck in materialist reductionism that they're not jumping to these conclusions, but they need to start thinking outside of the box. Hate that term, but nevertheless, purely and simply because this is where the evidence is taking them in terms of cosmology, which we'll now go into in a second. But very quickly, just to explain, holograms are very interesting things. If you take a holographic image and smash it into pieces, each of the shattered pieces will have a denuded part of the whole image. So in other words, within a hologram, the part is contained in the whole. And that's a very important thing to grasp as we carry forward now for the last 15 minutes or so of this presentation. There's just examples there of how holograms could work. Because the reason I'm saying this is because there is fascinating research taking place now that is proving more and more a hypothesis that was put forward in the 1990s called the holographic universe theory. And this is the idea that the universe itself is a hologram, a huge, huge hologram. So what we think of as three-dimensional reality, in fact, is a projection, and we exist within this projection. Now, again, I have to stress here, this is leading scientists. This is not New Agers or anything else. These are the world's leading researchers in the subject of things like black holes. Like, for instance, a lot of the material I'm going to be telling you now came from New Scientist. No, from Scientific American, an article in Scientific American. So this is serious research, and there's more and more evidence that this is the case. And there's David Bohm. And what David Bohm was arguing, as I said earlier, was that everything's single. I'll just ring out a quote here. Ultimately, the entire universe, with all its particles, including those constituting human beings, the laboratories, observing instruments, etc., has to be understood as a single, undivided whole, in which analysis into separately and independently existent parts has no fundamental status. In other words, we are a single unity. The idea of the old Buddhist concept of non-duality. This is exactly what it means. We are one entity experiencing itself subjectively, and I'll expand on that if I get time as I come towards the end of the presentation. Basically, the mystery is something called entropy. Entropy is what we understand time to be. It's the idea that everything moves only in one direction, from being highly ordered to being highly disordered. And as it becomes more disordered, it increases in its entropy. So, for example, you have an egg. An egg is it's entropy. You drop it on the floor and you smash it, you've increased the entropy. Now, the problem with entropy is that all systems work within this concept of things winding down and becoming disordered. The one thing that tends to counter that is life. Life goes the other way, doesn't it? We are evolving and becoming more specialized and more ordered, whereas the rest of the universe is becoming more disordered. So that there's initially that mismatch. But we then have the issue of entity as information. That entity can be described mathematically. Not only can it be described mathematical, to all intents and purposes, entity is mathematical. And then we have a problem, because when we then get to black holes, which we know exist, and of course very quickly a black hole is something that it's the escape velocity to escape from the Earth to go to the moon, for instance, and escape the Earth's gravitational pull. A rocket has to be sent up at 24,000 miles an hour. That's the escape velocity. That is because the Earth is a particular size. The escape velocity on the moon is a good deal less. That's why moon rockets, when they take off from the moon, don't need as much energy. It's to do with the mass of the Earth. Now imagine an object who is much more massive than that, a star that has collapsed into itself, and in fact all the space that I talked about before, all that 99.9 etc. space is crammed in, and all the subatomic particles are crammed into each other. That effectively is the start of a black hole, because the gravitational pull of something that dense is greater than 186,000 miles a second, the speed of light, which means nothing can escape from a black hole. Once it's in a black hole, it's lost. That means everything. But the universe is an enclosed system. There's nothing outside of it. Now, if entropy and information is energy, it means it's physical. And leading researchers discovered now that energy is physical. Numbers are physical. Mathematics is physical. So if information is physical, what happens when you throw a mobile phone into a computer, into a black hole? All that information is lost because it's destroyed, completely and utterly destroyed. It just disappears. But the second law of thermodynamics states that energy and matter can only be changed into something else, because we know matter and energy are the same thing. So what is the information on my mobile phone if I throw it into a black hole, or indeed the information describing anything that falls into a black hole? Where does it go? Well, the argument is it's smeared over the event horizon. Stephen Hawking, in the last few years of his life, wrote a paper on this and argued that there's something called Hawking radiation that comes out of a black hole, and also all that information is smeared on the edge of the black hole. That means that there are literally images, and all that information is like a huge hard drive containing the information describing everything that's fallen into it. And there's the idea, you have the idea of information, numbers, digital information falling into this hole. But what the latest theory is that going back, imagine the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Everything came from nothing in an instant. And in my new book, I talk about just how weird that is, how weird that concept is, because time was also created in the Big Bang, which wasn't big and wasn't a bang. And also, how could anything happen when there was no time? But that's another point which I haven't got time to go into now. So it expands outwards, doesn't it? You remember it bangs out, and there was a period of hyperinflation in the first nanoseconds to explain some of the mathematical structures we see. Then it expands out. So it's now been expanding for 13.8 billion years or so, which means from our point of view here, from 13.8 billion years in all light years in all directions, we're on the inside of like a huge inflating balloon. They suggest that at the inside edge of that are little squares called Planck squares, named after Max Planck, the guy that started the whole quantum revolution. And these are effectively the smallest piece of area you can possibly have. The 3 Planck lengths as a square. Smallest piece of area you can have. They have discovered, how they've done this I don't know, but they calculated that if each Planck square at the inside edge of the universe contains 1 bit of information, that aggregate bits of information is exactly the amount of information needed to describe the universe as it exists at the moment. Now, I'm not a mathematician, nor am I a cosmologist, but I know that they are intrigued by that because they were surprised at that relationship, which means it's so close, it suggests that this is, in fact, a simulation or an instantation, as I call it in terms of, in deference to a fellow researcher called Dr. Andrew Gallimore. But effectively, it does seem, in my new book, I do the science of exactly how this could be a simulation. Now, if it's a simulation, this then brings up some interesting points. Because if the universe is made of information, could all of that information and more of the information in the greater universe be contained and encoded in dark energy and dark matter? Is in fact, again, recent research has shown that only around about 4% of the universe is what's called baryonic matter. That is the physical matter that we see around us. The rest of it is either dark energy or dark matter. But we don't know what dark energy and dark matter is. We have no idea. All we know is we call it dark because we don't know what it is. We know it's there because it's to do with how galaxies revolve. There's a lady called Vera Rubin, I think it was, who noticed that galaxies spin in completely the wrong way. And there's clearly far more matter affecting the galaxy with its gravitational force. So the question is, what's all that dark energy? Could that dark energy be, in fact, something we also know called zero-point energy? And we know that this could be where all the energy is needed to encode not only this universe, but all the outcomes of every decision that can be made in this universe. So in fact, are we living in a simulated 3-dimensional version of reality where everything that can happen will happen? And again, 2 points here. Stephen Hawking, in his last paper, came up with something called the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics that suggested that every outcome of every decision that we can ever make is already encoded out there. It already exists, as does the outcomes of decisions you make on a third-person computer game, where every decision you make is encoded to make you enjoy playing the game. So, suddenly now we have a much more complex universe, where we have a universe that seems to be created in some way by mind. In other words, going back to what I said before, subatomic particles, the baryonic matter that we were talking about before, the 4% of this reality, is changed from a potentiality to an actuality, i.e. a statistical wave that an object will be in one place or another. The object appears in one place rather than another when it is observed by a conscious observer. Now, does this then start to make sense in terms of what the egregores may be, what these ghosts may be, what telekinesis may be, what aliens may be, all the entities that we discuss? And what about the locations we discuss? You know, the idea, where do we go when we dream? Where do we go when we go into out-of-body experiences? Well, I'd argue we're in the dark energy zone, where they're just as real because they're being created by a human mind that's dreaming. But it's a collective human mind. This is the most important point, that we are not singular entities. We are part of a greater consciousness field. And again, is that consciousness field the consciousness field of dark energy or whatever? So what this effectively means is that reality that we understand now and our science is developing to understand can accommodate all the things that you guys have experienced. Because if they are thought forms, which they have to be because you have experienced them, they have existence. And they are just as real as we are, even though we are creating them. So effectively, we exist within we have a brain that works holographically, which is non-physical and is information, which is processing non-physical reality, which is made out of information. We are turning that information back on itself into our anticipations of the universe and the world. Therefore, if you are expecting to see a poltergeist, you will see it. If you and your group together expect to see an entity, you will see it. Given enough concentration, you will bring that into existence. My work for the next few years is going to be focusing in on trying to nail this, trying to really understand. Because if I'm right, I can explain every single psychic phenomenon, from near-death experiences to out-of-body experiences. And in my corpus of books, my new book is due out, which is my 12th, I believe I can explain it. And it's for you guys to decide whether my explanation has validity or not. Thank you very much for listening.